Out of the numerous subsets of the Sonic fanbase that are out there, no doubt one of the most consistently boisterous is that of the Sonic Adventure diehards. Out of all the many titles that Sonic has had over the years, it's been fascinating to see the constant demand for a continuation of the Adventure series, or at the very least a return to the Sonic Adventure formula, which was utilized in 5 main series Sonic titles: Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes, Shadow the Hedgehog, and Sonic the Hedgehog, aka Sonic 06. Having really gotten into the fanbase around the year 2000, I'm extremely aware of the appeal of the adventure titles. The Sonic Adventure demo was often available to play at places like KB Toys and Hollywood Video around the time that it was released, and it was my first experience playing the series. People who've seen my top 5 Sonic games are aware that I named Sonic Adventure 2 Battle as my second favorite Sonic game of all time, though that's now been pushed back to number 3 with the release of Mania. I can attest, however, to the power of nostalgia of those titles for people around my age. With this awareness, however, comes one of the most fascinating phenomenons with the Sonic fanbase. The adventure games, by many an adventure fan, are often called perfect or nearly flawless, the closest Sonic has ever come to working well in 3D. This is despite the fact that all 5 adventure formula titles have significant technical issues that have only become more obvious as time has moved forward. Despite this, adventure fans remain one of the most adamant portions of the fanbase that these titles deserve another attempt. This hypothetical attempt is usually christened Sonic Adventure 3, a title pined for by fans since Sonic Adventure 2 was released in 2001. This dedication to the adventure formula begs the question: what is it about these titles that remains so appealing to so many fans of the series, especially when these 5 titles themselves differ so wildly from one another in almost every regard? People who have watched my Sonic Forces, The Problems We Are Ignoring video will recall that early on I make a comment mentioning that there's really no concrete adventure formula, that its tenets are so nebulous that whatever it is, if it even exists, would ultimately be far too broad to bother even attempting to define. That's why up until this point I have almost never really attempted to. That said, recent developments that have been taking place within the fanbase as well as in the game industry at large has given me reason to believe that defining the adventure formula may actually become very pertinent in the near future. What do I mean? Let me explain. I believe that current trends within the franchise itself and in the industry at large are going to result in a Sonic Adventure remake sooner rather than later. There are a few factors that make me believe this is the avenue Sonic Team will take. First off, many of the decisions being made in the development of Sonic Forces implies to me that this direction is more viable to the developer than it has been in the past. Most Sonic fans will be aware that the Sonic OC community is generally pretty intertwined with the Sonic Adventure diehard community. The fact that Sonic Team has opened up their field of vision to be aware enough of one of those segments of the fanbase to the degree that they based an entire design decision off of it inevitably means that they will open up their vision to the other. Looking at panels with the head of Sonic Team, Takashi Iizuka, whenever he's asked about or fans demand the return of things like the Chow Garden or when Sonic Adventure 3 will be released, he usually seems genuinely surprised that people want to see them return. It's possible that this is a put-on, but I genuinely believe that this comes from a place of Sonic Team, being based in Japan, being so far removed from the core Sonic fanbase, which has always been concentrated more in the Western Hemisphere, that they are genuinely oblivious to this kind of demand. I believe that this is in the process of changing. Second, with Sonic Adventure's 20th anniversary coming up in 2018, the series has developed a significant amount of nostalgia value with fans. And as Sonic Team has made it very clear over the last almost 8 years, nostalgia is now the only ace in the hole they ever think to fall back on. It totally stands to reason that Iizuka will remain true to form and utilize this approach in the future, for better or for worse. Third, Sonic Team often likes to pay attention to the trends that are being set by other Japanese publishers. We saw this heavily with Unleashed that included a dual playstyle with the Werehog only a couple of years after Nintendo did so with Twilight Princess, as well as with how the Werehog operated, with a beat-em-up playstyle eerily similar to that of Sony's God of War series. If this has remained true, I believe that Sega and Sonic Team have been paying close attention to what Sony is doing with the ground-up remakes of old IPs, such as the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, Square Enix's Final Fantasy VII remake, or the upcoming Shadow of the Colossus remake. They would have to be blind to ignore that kind of money-making possibility. While all of this is conjecture and ultimately just an educated guess on my part that could easily not come to pass, I believe that the current trends are pointing heavily towards this possibility. And in the same way that the Crash Insane Trilogy is now causing rumors to swell about a brand new traditional style Crash game running on the Insane Trilogy engine, what do you think Sonic Team would attempt to do with a brand new, rebuilt from scratch iteration of Sonic Adventure's physics and collision engine after the remake? Yeah, now you see where I'm going with this. Notice how throughout this whole first portion, I've stated what I think will happen, but not really discussed whether or not I think it should happen. The reason for this is simply because my position on this is conflicting. By this point, listeners in my essay should be well aware of the fact that I detest how often nostalgia is used as a crutch in the Sonic series. If you're still celebrating that 100% you got on a spelling test in the first grade after 10 years, that probably means that you haven't done anything else worthy of celebrating in the interim, which really reflects a misplaced priority more than anything. Inversely, however, while I was initially ecstatic to see Sonic Forces going back to the boost formula and refining it further from that which Sonic Generations has done, it's become apparent at this point, both from footage that I've seen and from the people that I've spoken to who have played the demo, that Sonic Team has actually gone back to Color's playstyle instead, which is significantly more clunky and less refined than Generations. This means a less refined gameplay style overall, forgoing the use of nearly as many sloped and momentum-building level design styles for Color's blocky platforming, though recently the tag team mode was shown off and, provided it's not a slap-together afterthought, does show some potential. Based on those two thought processes, while my distaste for nostalgia pandering is strong, seriously, it's pretty much the only thing keeping Mania from being my #1 Sonic game of all time, I can't deny that I actually think Sonic Team going back and relearning the adventure formula for this possible remake would probably end up being a good decision. As much as I personally enjoy the boost games, I will not deny that over the years, Sonic Team's design philosophy has strayed further and further away from the essential elements of Sonic, and thereby diluting the gameplay more and more as time goes on. Despite Sonic Adventure's flaws, it no doubt came the closest of any of the 3D titles to bringing the pure essential elements into a 3D environment, at least of the official titles. And now with the opportunity of getting to do so without the technical limitation of the Dreamcast hardware, a remake comes with the potential of correcting the technical issues that the original title stumbled with, such as occasionally wonky physics, frame rate stutters, and finicky collision, provided Sonic Team is willing to put the time and effort into fixing it. I personally have very little understanding of how the original adventure engine functioned, where its flaws lie, and how it was limited by the Dreamcast hardware. Fortunately, however, as a member of the Sonic Retro fan community, there's no shortage of talented and knowledgeable tech members to ask. So in order to gain a better understanding of Sonic Adventure's engine and therefore of its shortfalls, I reached out to Retro Tech member Morph, who has spent years reverse engineering, studying, and modding Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2. While he prefaces this information that he shared with me with the fact that he has not fully cracked how the precise collision detection is implemented in Sonic Adventure, he has a ton of information to impart. He stated that he guessed that the technical wonkiness of Sonic Adventure stems from a combination of factors, including a rushed development cycle, questionable priority allotment, and technical limitations of the Dreamcast coupled with Sonic Team's inexperience with the hardware, considering it was a launch title for the system. Morph has this to say: while it does do a fairly good job all things considered, there was obvious room for improvement. The fact that they got a collision system up and running which was capable of handling Sonic's speed and physics on what is effectively a launch title is fairly impressive. They had to make an efficient system to run on a 200 MHz CPU, so I can imagine that they ran into some issues there. This combined with Sonic Adventure's Lantern engine, a system that was run on the CPU as the Dreamcast did not have a programmable graphics pipeline shaders, is probably what led them to aiming for 30 frames per second as well. This is why most prototype footage appears to be in slow motion. The game is attempting to run at 60 frames per second, but isn't hitting that target, and so it's getting double buffered down to 30 frames per second, resulting in that slow motion thing. In the Dreamcast case, you can manipulate the lighting of each vertex of every model in the entire scene before it gets sent off to be rendered. This manipulation was performed on the CPU. It was also only required if you needed to perform advanced effects though. Otherwise, the Dreamcast's fixed function pipeline would do all the work, lighting, texture mapping, etc. on the GPU as usual, as far as I know. This is how the Lantern engine lighting system worked in Sonic Adventure 1. It would run its own lighting algorithm for each vertex of each model in the scene to select a color from an arbitrarily selected diffuse and/or specular color palette, or maybe more accurately, gradient. The brightness worked as an index into that palette to use the vertex's color. So I theorized that the overhead of this system, coupled with the inexperience with the Dreamcast at the time, is what led to the frame rate limit that the original Sonic Adventure had. Sonic Adventure 2 did not have the same performance issue and was arguably more graphically demanding, lighting notwithstanding. The Dreamcast, as revolutionary as it was for the time, simply could not handle the complexity of the high-speed physics and collision perfectly in the way that they were utilized in Sonic Adventure 1, as the console had plenty of other work to do when it came to graphical and lighting display as well. Design changes also somewhat reduced the pure elements of Sonic that Adventure's design philosophy more wholeheartedly utilized. This homogenization continued up to the point that little remained of the solid attempt that they had begun with, taking its last gasps with Sonic 06, a game which kept a lot of the adventure fundamentals but lacked decent execution, leading to its now infamous status. With that, I have now established my thesis. A. An adventure remake is likely coming. B. While I dislike the idea of Sonic Team's continuous abuse of nostalgia, the value of going back to an earlier time when the essential elements of Sonic were at least moderately being utilized will overall do more good than harm. And C. The core tenets of the adventure formula should be defined in order to discern the standard by which a potential new entry in the adventure formula should be structured by. That third aspect will be extremely difficult, however. As previously stated, there's very few concrete elements that were passed on from one adventure formula game to another, and those that were had their context entirely changed by other aspects of the games changing around them. The adventure formula, more so than the classic or the boost formulas, are extremely fluid, something that would be a great boon to the series, but one that is significantly more difficult to pull off to a successful degree. While mechanically, I think that fan projects such as Sonic Utopia and Lake Fepard's Hedge physics engine ultimately represent the kind of gameplay that an ideal Sonic adventure formula game would utilize, Sonic Team has made it pretty clear that at this point they have little concern with that degree of adherence to the essential elements, so I will avoid to the best of my ability referring to what-if scenarios. Instead, this essay will only be focusing on elements that were clearly used across all 5 existing adventure formula titles, or at the very least, in the case of the first tenet I will be addressing, clearly intended to be a focus if in execution it was not fully realized. With these parameters established and the stipulation that each game must utilize a core Sonic gameplay experience, which before you say anything, Shadow the Hedgehog indeed does in all but name, let's begin with the first adventure formula tenet. An emphasis on exploration. I will readily admit that this first tenet is very much bending the stipulations I established about an aspect having to be present in all 5 adventure formula games. Because let me make this extremely clear. All 5 adventure formula games are extremely linear. Even Adventure 1, which adventure diehards generally hold up as an indication of the intent to utilize explorative level design, does not actually use anything close to it in the levels themselves. Multiple paths are almost entirely absent, being relegated to sparse secondary paths which quickly reconverge with the main route, or complete dead ends with occasional item capsules to make the detour slightly less a waste of time. Resulting games narrowed the amount of options down even further, with Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes, and Shadow the Hedgehog being the most linear main series games, significantly more so than the boost formula games that have garnered the mostly inaccurate tagline of being boost to win, despite having by far the most involved alternate paths and speedrunning potential. Surprisingly, Sonic 06 actually opened the main level design back up again to a more adventure-esque proportion, due to utilizing a game structure that was fairly identical, but it was let down by poor execution. So if the adventure formula doesn't have all that much actual exploration, why would exploration be one of its tenets? While it's true that exploration is not a major factor in terms of the core experience, every adventure formula game incorporates it in some way, shape, or form. Sonic Adventure 1 uses it in its admittedly small but still non-linear hub worlds and treasure hunting stages. Adventure 2 uses it in some of its secondary objectives in the Sonic, Shadow, and Tails and Eggman levels, as well as in its own treasure hunting stages. Heroes incorporates basic scavenger hunt elements into its Team Chaotix gameplay. Shadow encourages backtracking in its missions involving finding keys for the hidden weapon doors, as well as its non-neutral objectives. And Sonic 06 actually has a decent amount of exploration in several of the areas that require all 3 main characters to visit it, as well as in the levels that Knuckles and Rouge have portions in. While never a main focus in the games themselves, exploration is clearly present as a supplemental element in all 5 adventure formula titles. Moreover, it was clear from how the games were promoted that Sonic Team wanted players to see it as something that the games brought to the table, whether they really did or not. And ultimately, it's something that the vast majority of adventure fans have come to associate with those particular titles, whether that's actually true or not. As such, a future adventure formula title would be expected to utilize such a mechanic as part of its DNA. Exploration in multiple paths, as I slightly touched on in the essential elements of Sonic, offer replay value and the opportunity for a more enriching experience for the players willing to seek it out. Furthermore, exploration used correctly has the potential of helping a game feel overall more cohesive as a whole. When levels are fleshed out in a way that makes them more than just straight corridors, they cease to be just self-contained locales and elevates them to becoming more engrossing connective tissue of a larger cohesive whole. Sonic 06, despite its numerous flaws and failures, at least handled this portion of its level design extremely well. The world in 06 feels cohesive. While you are getting warped across numerous locales that clearly aren't right next to Soliana, these areas still feel like they belong in the same game. Staging both major cutscenes as well as boss encounters in these areas add additional immersion, making 06 at least feel consistent within its own established geography and various events, than games like Sonic Generations or Lost World that lack any core cohesion whatsoever. For all my misgivings about Sonic Forces, I will concede that it also seems to be handling this correctly, at least from what I've seen so far. An example of this is how we see the large pyramid in the background of classic Sonic and the custom character stages, and assumedly modern Sonic's Green Hill as well, getting closer with each stage until the pyramid is finally being infiltrated by Sonic and the custom character in the tag team stage. Establishing a cohesive geography, at least through the framing of, and ideally through the use of zones that permit a higher degree of exploration, is invaluable to the overall feel of the game and its narrative, whether it be in-depth or sparse. On the topic of narrative, let's go ahead and transition to the second point. Story told from multiple different narrative perspectives. Two elements of the adventure titles that adventure fans, as well as many other Sonic fans outside of the adventure sphere, clamor for the return of is multiple playable characters and a serious or in-depth plot. These two elements are undeniably linked, though in actuality, neither of them are in and of themselves core tenets of the adventure formula, despite what I'm sure is the opinion of many who are leaving angry comments right this second arguing the contrary. These inextricably linked elements, as well as the outspoken fan demands for their inclusion, is likely one of the factors that has made defining the adventure formula so difficult. Because so much focus is put on these two elements, it becomes difficult to realize that they are in fact both merely tools utilized to accomplish the real tenet behind them. Adventure formula titles utilize narratives told from multiple perspectives. Not all 5 of the Adventure Formula games employ an in-depth or dark plot. Adventure 1 uses a fairly serious storyline, but with varying and oftentimes awkward tonal shifts. Adventure 2 has a decidedly more consistent tone, but a darker bent. This is in contrast to Sonic Heroes, which has an extremely sparse and significantly lighter-toned plot, which creates an immense amount of whiplash when looking at Shadow the Hedgehog, which features the most pathetically grimdark and try-hard story of the entire series, which Sonic Team quietly and ashamedly backpedaled back from to a more even-keeled but still slightly cringy self-series plot in Sonic 06. What can clearly be seen here is that there's no concrete adventure formula plot or tone, and that which is best suited to this series is clearly an extremely subjective matter. The only thing consistent in this regard about the 5 titles is that each tells a story seen from multiple perspectives throughout, and that the only way to experience the full plots is to experience it from all of the available perspectives, as the adventure formula titles do not give the entirety of its narrative from a single playthrough. Now granted, this is generally done through the use of multiple playable characters, however this is not the case with all of the titles, as we are faced with the awkward black sheep of the series Shadow the Hedgehog. That said, it still experiences a multi-perspective narrative. Just instead of using several different characters, we experience the story of Shadow through a branching path system, each bringing its own revelations and developments, and only through exploring them all will the player be given the opportunity to see the final true ending. This multifaceted approach is likely what most fans have interpreted as a more story-centric philosophy about the adventure formula titles versus the titles that have followed after. In actuality, this perceived depth is not actually a result of the merit of the writing itself, but from the jigsaw puzzle-esque approach through which the story is presented to the player. While it does not in and of itself affect the quality or the depth of the plot that it's telling, it does cause how the player interacts with that plot to become more engrossing, making their decisions to delve deeper into the game result in a greater understanding of the entire big picture, thus making the narrative more impactful of an experience. As many fans are aware, 2 titles in the Sonic series were internally referred to and developed under the name Sonic Adventure 3, though neither of them ultimately shipped with that title. Sonic 06, and Sonic Unleashed, or as it's known in Japan, Sonic World Adventure. While Sonic 06 is clearly an adventure formula game through and through, I would certainly not consider Sonic Unleashed an adventure formula game despite the moniker under which it began production. And this is not for the same reason that many fans would discount it as an adventure game either. While many fans would refuse to acknowledge Unleashed as an adventure formula title due to its boost function, there's absolutely no reason to discount it because of it. It's like claiming Adventure 1 isn't an adventure game because it doesn't feature grinding as a mechanic and all the others do. The argument simply does not hold water. And as we already established, Unleashed actually incorporates a lot more exploration and multiple paths than 3 out of the 5 established adventure titles. There are 0 gameplay reasons that Sonic Unleashed should not be considered an adventure formula game through and through. There's so much in terms of differentiation between how the adventure formula titles are different from one another that it really shouldn't factor in. And besides, boosting actually was in Sonic Heroes, so there you go. So why don't I actually consider Unleashed an adventure formula title if that's the case? Simply put, Unleashed does not utilize this multifaceted approach to narrative. The entirety of the game is experienced squarely from one perspective. It does not require multiple characters to complete, nor does it require multiple playthroughs or exploration of alternative story branches. All of Unleashed plot is experienceable in one go. That's not to say it isn't an excellent plot in its own right. In fact, I would personally say Unleashed plot mops the floor with every other Sonic game's plot hands down. Its tone is light in its approach, but it still allows for gravitas and pathos when required and can shift between the light and the dark elements without feeling off balance, which is more than can be said for the majority of Sonic titles. It just doesn't utilize narrative in the same way as the adventure formula titles. There is a reason that many fans associate this multi-narrative approach intrinsically to multiple characters when it comes to the adventure formula. And while multiple characters are not necessarily an element of the adventure formula, an aspect that they represent does come into play with the final portion of this essay. Secondary gameplay remains supplemental to the primary gameplay. Something the adventure formula titles handled significantly better than the current boost formula games is the idea that Sonic's primary gameplay is the main attraction. It's the Sonic gameplay that was intended to be the main draw of the title, and additional secondary elements were there merely to add additional value to enhance the standalone product. Ultimately, whether it was secondary characters or game-specific gimmicks like the team system of heroes or the shooting mechanics of Shadow, all of the secondary mechanics of the adventure formula titles were developed from the core Sonic gameplay that was featured in that specific game. For instance, in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, each character operates in a way clearly related to Sonic, but with different variables associated to each character for the sake of gameplay diversity. This is most clearly seen with Tails and Knuckles in Sonic Adventure 1, who operate almost precisely like Sonic's core gameplay, but lack the defining characteristics reserved for Sonic and having their own to make up for it. While the other three characters in Adventure, Amy, Gamma, and Big, all have mechanics that feel further removed from the main trio, all function mechanically the same using momentum-based platforming, but with their own flourish. Adventure 2 handles this the exact same way. While Tails and Eggman's mech stages certainly at that point had become far more developed into their own style of gameplay, the lineage of that gameplay could still be clearly traced back to Gamma in Adventure 1 and thereby back to Sonic. Even not accounting for that lineage, Tails and Eggman's gameplay still utilizes momentum and level structuring present in Sonic Adventure 2's core gameplay conventions. This also holds true for later games within the context of their own definition of what the core gameplay is. While a couple of the post-adventure formula titles have also handled this in a similar way, specifically Sonic Colors' use of wisps and essentially the entirety of Sonic Lost Worlds mechanics, those games were let down by how other factors weakened the overall game as a whole. Colors' overemphasis on 2D and blocky platforming, and Lost Worlds' lack of momentum-based platforming. But the significantly more refined titles of recent times, Sonic Unleashed and Sonic Generations, and soon-to-be Sonic Forces, have taken a different approach to how supplemental mechanics are utilized. These three titles specifically put significantly less stock in its established core gameplay than the other titles that preceded it. In fact, overall use of the core gameplay is often only 50% of each respective game's playtime, if not significantly less. This alone is not necessarily a deal breaker though. In games like Sonic Adventure, Adventure 2, and 06, while Sonic's gameplay was the longest standalone, by the time that you factored in secondary mechanics and considered them all together as one, 50-50 sounds about as accurate for them as well. But as previously stated, the secondary mechanics there were all derived from the game's core gameplay style, whereas these three titles in question do not. In Sonic Unleashed, the Werehog portions nearly entirely reframe how 3D platforming is approached from the main boost gameplay. This ranges from how levels are traversed and completed, to even the metric by which success is determined. As a result, it feels like a completely different game, and one that is clearly given more screen time than the supposed core gameplay. In Sonic Generations, classic Sonic has a problem a bit more complicated. From a surface perspective, Generations seems to utilize a more adventure formula approach to classic Sonic's integration. However, fundamental differences between how modern Sonic and classic Sonic's physics are presented result in two completely different gameplay styles, but different in ways that make it clear that they were developed with two very different design philosophies in mind. Once again, splitting the game's intent into two. While both of them are technically core Sonic, they come from two different eras of what core Sonic gameplay is, with little cohesion between the two. The same issue applies to classic Sonic's inclusion in Sonic Forces, a game that, with everything else it's trying to accomplish, desperately needs to focus on fewer things to ensure that it does its core mechanics correctly and in a refined manner. The best way I can differentiate the way that the adventure formula handles its secondary mechanics versus the way that the boost formula handles theirs is like this. The adventure formula's approach is the equivalent of several instruments like guitars, vocals, bass, and drums all coming together to form a full song. The instruments may be different from one another, but they're all used to create a cohesive whole. Contrast that by the way that Unleashed, Generations, and Forces uses their secondary mechanics. It's like taking a fully completed song, but the label producers decided that it's not going to sell enough units, or perhaps the song isn't all that good in the first place, so they decide to mask it by tacking on some trendy featured artists to mask the shortfalls. Going back to the issue of confidence and laziness that I referred to in my Sonic Forces The Problems We Are Ignoring essay. But with all that said, there's certainly plenty of other aspects that unify the adventure formula games together and differentiate them from other titles in the series. These are only some of the first primary blocks by which the adventure formula can be defined. But with the potential of an adventure revisit and a possible new adventure formula title on the horizon, understanding even a few of these elements that made these titles endear themselves to a generation of Sonic fans is more imperative than ever to ensure that it has a standard to shoot for if Sonic Team is willing to put forth that effort. Clearly, something about these 5 titles did something special to have garnered such steadfast support from adventure diehards, and at least in the beginning, critical acclaim. And if understanding and defining a few of these building blocks and their uses help in some way to recapture some of that elusive magic, then the effort to analyze and solidify them into a working design philosophy will have been worth it. But for now, that's all I've got. Have a good one.